This week on the Wheelhouse. Horseshoe crabs. And a little later, shellfish. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. All week long, Connecticut Public's talk shows are celebrating all things nautical with its first ever NautiWeek. That means we're diving into Connecticut's shoreline and beyond, covering everything from sea shanties to people literally living underwater. Because we're all about politics here at the Wheelhouse, we're going big on some sea creatures getting attention at the state capitol. First up, horseshoe crabs. Despite their name, horseshoe crabs aren't actually crabs. In fact, they're more closely related to spiders and scorpions. Horseshoe crabs are a common sight on Connecticut's shoreline. They've been around for a long time, hundreds of millions of years. These living fossils existed well before even the dinosaurs. But horseshoe crabs may not be a fixture of our beaches down the line. In recent years, there's been a steep decline in horseshoe crab populations in Connecticut. So dramatic, the state lawmakers voted to ban the hand harvesting of these creatures just this year. At the same time, there are people in our state working tirelessly to protect horseshoe crabs. Back in mid-June, our colleague in the newsroom, Jenny Ahrens, joined some researchers at Milford Point on a windy day. They're part of Project Limulus. That's a research program based at Sacred Heart University that studies horseshoe crabs in Long Island Sound.
So you can see she has barnacles, algae, slipper shells hanging out on her carapace here. You can see her two compound eyes. Now she's an older female, and I can tell that just by looking at her eyes and her shell. So if you look at her eyes, you guys see how they're like dark and black? When they're young, these are honey golden brown, and they look like a fly's eyes. They have that honeycomb pattern. And then if you look at her carapace, you can see she's got all these like scratches and pitting, and then she's got some damage, right, like her points gone here. Horseshoe crabs, when they're young, are also pretty fuzzy. Back here, you can see she's got like some of these little bristles left, but not really a whole lot. She's definitely older. And then she also has a pretty significant mating scar. So right here is the point where the male shell rubs against her when they're mating, just because he hangs on that back part, right?
That's Jo Marie Kasanak, director of Project Limulus. Every May and June, horseshoe crabs come to shore to mate.
The males have these specialized claws in the front called claspers that look like boxing gloves that he uses to hook onto the shell of the female, and then she drags him up to the beach so that she can make a nest. She'll take a nest, lay the eggs, and then he goes ahead and fertilizes them. Within 4 to 6 weeks, we have little baby horseshoe crabs swimming around in the water. So pretty cool.
A big part of Project Limulus's research involves something called tagging. That's when you attach white disc tags to horseshoe crab shells to track their movement patterns. They're then released back into the water.
So this is a pretty good area to look. We kind of like walk all the way around the point if we want. So you guys have met my interns, right? So they all have tagging supplies and I have tagging supplies. So if we find crabs, we'll bring them up and we'll get into groups to tag. We'll teach you guys how to do it, but like this is all for you today. So like you guys can help us collect all the data, do the measurements, do the tagging, bring us crabs, like, but don't feel like you have to do anything you're not comfortable with, right? You don't want to tag, you don't want to pick them up. That's totally fine too. There's plenty of people here who are willing to do that.
Tagging doesn't harm horseshoe crabs. If you do it right, they barely notice.
It looks scary, essentially, but it's essentially, I've got my ears pierced for doing the same thing for her. It's not going to hurt the As the story that Professor Kasanak has told us is she has fully tagged them while they have been mid-nesting, and she's just kept on digging. So maybe a slight moment of that, but that would be it. So we like to say,
That's great.
if there is any barnacles that kind of make that happen, I'll kind of just clear them off here. Just a refresher. And this just side, they don't even really feel it. And we just kind of use it to scrape it off. Make sure the tag is going to lay nice and flat.
That was student researcher Kyra Lerner. For more on this, we're joined by two great guests. John Moritz, state reporter, Hearst Connecticut Media Group. Good morning, John. How are you today?
I'm good. Good morning to you.
Jo Marie Kasanek, director of Project Limulus at Sacred Heart University. Good morning. Thank you for coming on the Wheelhouse.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I want to know what got you interested in studying horseshoe crabs specifically, and what's it about these creatures?
So I fell into studying horseshoe crabs kind of randomly when I was an undergraduate research student at Sacred Heart University. I was taking my first biology course, and the professor there realized that I was kind of bored in class and asked me to join him for research. And I started working on a project looking at the population genetics of horseshoe crabs. And I was somebody who grew up in Milford, Connecticut, right along the Long Island Sound. And I don't think I ever saw a horseshoe crab on the beach until I started doing research on them, which is kind of funny. I love working with them now because even though they are not the most charismatic or beautiful creatures to everyone, they really do draw a crowd. And I found that the people who come to learn about these amazing creatures really love them and are really passionate about their conservation.
What about Project Limulus and the work that you all do? How did the kind of interest that you had in studying horseshoe crabs kind of really get involved with that?
Yeah, so the project was started back in 1997 by my former coworker, Dr. Jennifer Mattei at Sacred Heart University. She was part of a group that noticed a decline in the population of horseshoe crabs in Long Island Sound starting in about the mid-90s, and was always interested in conservation and wanted to know what was going on with the horseshoe crabs and kind of fell into that work. So she started Project Limulus as a research and education effort to really try to figure out what was going on with the population of crabs in the Sound, but then to also educate the public about the importance of the conservation of nature and kind of working to protect our shorelines. And so I first got involved with the project back in 2008 as one of her research assistants. And then in 2015, I joined as the outreach and education coordinator, and then more recently have taken over the project as the director because unfortunately Jennifer passed away this past December.
And if anybody were to ever hear Dr. Mattei or you talk about horseshoe crabs, I think they would care tremendously about horseshoe crabs. So can you please help me and our listeners understand why they should like and care about horseshoe crabs?
The first reason people should care about horseshoe crabs is because they've been around for a really long time. We're talking 450 million years, morphologically unchanged. These guys walked with the dinosaurs, and they survived all of the mass extinction events that took out the dinosaurs and a lot of other creatures. So they're an organism that is just really well adapted to living on our planet. And they have all these wonderful connections to other species. So they're ecologically important in terms of their eggs make really great food for those birds that make long migrations, like the endangered red knot. They're also important in the fishing industry. They're used as bait to catch some commercially important species like eel. And then lastly, they have a really important connection to human health. So horseshoe crabs have been studied for all sorts of medical applications, but probably the most important one is the Limulus amoebocyte lysate, which is used to test vaccines and other medical devices to make sure that they're free from bacterial contamination before they're administered here in the United States. So if anybody has ever gotten a flu shot or a COVID vaccine, they can thank a horseshoe crab for their blood donation that led to the making of that LAL test, which then makes sure that they were safe before they got their vaccine.
John Moritz, I want to bring you in here. Is there anything else you want to add about the importance of horseshoe crabs for their ecosystems?
Because of their importance in the ecosystem, this legislation that passed earlier this year to ban the harvest really attracted a wide range of support among environmentalists and environmental groups. I think Jo Marie mentioned, that their eggs serve as an important food source for migrating birds, and the Audubon Society has gotten very involved in recent years, pushing for this ban on the harvest.
Big part of Project Limulus, Jo Marie, involves tagging horseshoe crabs along Connecticut's shoreline. Why is that so important to your research? What does it do?
So part of the reason why we tag horseshoe crabs is to learn about their movement patterns. The tags themselves can also be used as a rough estimate of their population size if you're able to put out enough tags and then recapture enough of those tagged individuals. It's a pretty common technique in population biology, these mark recapture studies. And so we have been tagging since about, I think it's 1997 when the project started. It started with these old cinch tags that Jennifer had made, and then later on switched over to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service white disc tags, which we still use today. And at this point, we've tagged over 98,000 horseshoe crabs in Long Island Sound. And we have a fairly successful recapture rate. So somewhere around 7% of the crabs that we tag we'll find again at some point. And just to put that into perspective, birders who might participate in bird banding typically have a recapture rate of about 1%. So we're doing pretty well in that respect. And so it gives us information about, where do the horseshoe crabs go? So we found through our tagging that about half of the crabs that are in Long Island Sound come back to the same beach the next year when they're making their nests during their mating season. And the other half move around. They're highly migratory. So crabs in Long Island Sound don't just stay in Long Island Sound. They'll make it all the way to the outer side of Long Island, down to New Jersey and Delaware. And the furthest crab we've had travel made it all the way up to Maine, and it took it 8 years to do so.
How many species of horseshoe crabs are there today, and what kind do we see here in Connecticut as per the tagging that you all have done?
Yeah, so there are 4 species of horseshoe crabs alive in the world today. 3 of them live off of the coast of Japan and Southeast Asia. And of those, 1 is endangered and the other 2 are about to be federally listed as threatened species. And then we have the American horseshoe crab, that's Limulus polyphemus, the species that we have here in the States. Their range is from Maine down to the Gulf of Mexico. And they're all one big species with kind of subpopulation structure based on their region. And so they are managed in kind of regional groups. And the crabs that we tag in Connecticut are part of the New York region. And if you think about it, the Long Island Sound has both New York and Connecticut, a little part of Rhode Island where the crabs are all kind of from those different areas, but in the same body of water. But yeah, those are the horseshoe crabs that we have here.
Hundreds of millions of years of evolution of the horseshoe crab.
From a morphological standpoint, the horseshoe crabs that we see today look almost exactly the same as the ones that were walking with the dinosaurs. That's attributed to the fact that they are a generalist species, that they kind of, they're not really choosy when it comes to who they mate with or what food they eat. They can tolerate low salinity, high salinity. If you just think about their range here in the States, where they're all the way down in the Gulf of Mexico, but also up in Maine, that's a pretty wide temperature range, as well as other environmental parameters. So we think those are some of the reasons why they've been able to survive for so long.
Seen this phrase tossed around, functionally extinct. That comes around with horseshoe crabs. What does that mean? And is it true?
That's a great question. So that's some language that's been used to describe at least our population of crabs here in Connecticut. And that comes from the fact that the horseshoe crabs almost serve as a foundational species in their ecosystem. So you may have heard of a keystone species, right? Something that has cascading effects down its food web or up its food web, depending on where it lies in that food chain. But foundational species are something that not necessarily are only important for food, but some other parameter for their ecosystem. So with horseshoe crabs, part of why they're so important, their connections to those migratory shorebirds, is that they lay up to 100,000 eggs every summer when they come up to mate. And when they do that, they dig a hole into the sand, and then they deposit their eggs, and then the males come and fertilize them. And in places where you have really high densities of horseshoe crabs, there's not really a lot of available beach for them to make nests in, so they accidentally dig up each other's eggs in the process of making their own nests. And what this allows is for shorebirds to come and eat those eggs because they're just kind of floating on top of the sand or like in the slush. Here in Connecticut, where we have pretty low densities, where we'll find female horseshoe crabs come up to the beach without a male attached to her to mate at all, there's a lot more open space. There's places for them to come and make a nest, and they're not doing that same thing where they're digging up each other's nests. So we actually don't really see horseshoe crab eggs being eaten by migratory shorebirds or shorebirds at all here in Connecticut. In fact, the only bird we've seen eat horseshoe crab eggs has been the Canada geese, who have figured out a way to disturb the nests by kicking their feet while they swim on top of them. And that kind of stirs up the sediment and allows some of the eggs to float to the surface, and then they eat them. So without the density that we should have to provide that foundation of, lots and lots of eggs to be used as this incredible food source, they're really not performing their function in their ecosystem in the part of the food web. And so that's why that term kind of like functionally extinct came about.
John, why have horseshoe crabs been in peril in Connecticut? We spoke about this a little bit earlier, but let's dive deeper into this conversation now.
One of the reasons that has traditionally been cited for their decline is the fact that they are harvested by fishermen, not for sale for a food market, but actually the fishermen use them for bait. In Connecticut specifically, one of the most common uses for horseshoe crabs is they're essentially just chopped up and put in traps that are used to catch what would be known as conch or whelk that are then sold both on the domestic and international market.
So not in Connecticut, but in other areas, horseshoe crabs are harvested for the pharmaceutical industry. They're taken to facilities and they give a blood donation. They'll bleed up to 30% of the horseshoe crab. And then they take it and they isolate that limulus amoebocyte lysate from it. What it is that they have this natural property that allows it to clump on contact when it senses bacterial endotoxins. And so we were able to take advantage of that by making this limulus amoebocyte lysate test, or LAL. And that's used to test vaccines and other medical devices to make sure that they're free of bacterial contamination. And even though there have been some synthetic alternatives to these tests that have been developed over the last decade or so, as of right now, that horseshoe crab blood test is what is federally mandated to make sure that vaccines and other equipment are safe before they're used.
So it sounds like horseshoe crabs are declining for both bait and pharmaceutical reasons then. Do we know how many horseshoe crabs are killed each year in Connecticut? Can we pinpoint that?
At one point, the numbers were numbered in the thousands. Fishermen would essentially go out at midnight during the new moon a couple times each summer, which is basically when these crabs come to shore to lay their eggs. And they would just catch them in the hundreds or thousands in a single sitting. Before the law passed earlier this year to ban that harvest, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection actually instituted their own regulations last year that caused that annual harvest to decline by 92%. Basically, speaking with fishermen, this had been an issue for so long and for so many years that a lot of them kind of expected that these tougher regulations and the eventual ban on the harvest would come down. So in the last couple of years, a lot of them, my understanding, have already been switching away, finding new sources for bait, which Jo Marie mentioned. While these crabs are used in biomedical research, that is not often taking place in the Sound. That takes place in other areas. So almost the entire harvest within the Sound and within Connecticut was for this fisherman harvest.
And what do we know about the climate crisis impact on horseshoe crabs? Has that also led to their decline?
So I have had this asked to me before, and at this point, I'm not seeing a big difference. So like people always ask, is it changing their spawning season maybe, right? Because we do know that temperature plays a role in when the horseshoe crabs are coming up to mate. And at least in the Long Island Sound, we haven't seen those effects yet. I do know that some of my colleagues who do research, in Florida or North Carolina have seen slight shifts in their mating season of their horseshoe crabs. But I think maybe because of how buffered the Long Island Sound is, at this point, we're not seeing those impacts. But I would imagine that climate will have some sort of impact on them, whether it's forcing them to switch to different spawning habitats as sea levels rising, or finding different food sources as kind of their normal food choices are potentially impacted by ocean acidification or just, other impacts of climate change that we might not think about on the daily basis.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Coming up, what policies are in place to protect horseshoe crabs? Stick with us after the break. You're listening to the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. And if you're just joining us, we've been talking about the importance of horseshoe crabs in Connecticut and efforts at the statewide level to protect them. Still with us are John Moritz, state reporter, Hearst Connecticut Media Group, and Jo Marie Kasanak, director of Project Limulus at Sacred Heart University. John Moritz, we're a politics show, so I want to zoom in on the policies aimed at preserving horseshoe crabs in Connecticut. You mentioned two things earlier, including regulation from a state agency and then the recent law passed at the state level. Let's go with the latter. Tell me about that new ban on harvesting these creatures.
Yeah, so this is a ban that passed through the legislature pretty much with broad bipartisan support in the early spring and summer. The ban actually does not go into effect till October 1st. So this is basically the last summer in which the commercial harvest in Connecticut waters will be illegal.
Taken together, you think about that 92% that we were talking about, that deep regulation that was made last year and that reduction of about 92%, something like that. Is there any estimate on any idea we could kind of take forward to figure out how this state ban now will help the situation?
Well, environmentalists are certainly bullish that it'll help the populations. I was talking with one of the fishermen out in Stonington earlier today, actually, who has one of the few licenses to harvest these creatures. And he said, basically, he went out in the spring and collected, I think, 200 or 300 as kind of his final go around. But my understanding from deep is that this was already a declining industry. And if it kind of bears out, and if you look at who submitted testimony to lawmakers and who showed up at the Capitol to advocate for and against this legislation, you had a lot of environmental groups obviously advocating for it, but none of the fishermen or their representative groups actually submitted testimony to oppose the bill, which I think is a testament to the fact that the industry has really moved beyond these creatures as a necessary bait.
Just want to circle back a little bit. The ban, how did it come to be? And talk to us about some of those groups you were talking about that showed up in support of this.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Audubon Society was one group that was heavily involved in pushing lawmakers for a ban. You also had groups such as Friends for Animals that were pushing for a ban. And basically how it went about is last year there was a similar bill that would have regulated and implemented a harvest ban. That bill did not end up passing. It passed the House, did not pass the Senate, kind of got lost in the legislative shuffle in the final days. But afterwards, DEEP came in with their own regulations. And what they said is you're not allowed to harvest on certain nights of the year when it is peak breeding opportunities for these animals. So as I mentioned, they frequently come ashore during midnight and full moon to lay their eggs. And when DEEP effectively said you're not allowed to harvest on those nights, it really limited the ability of fishermen to go out, which spurred their move to find other sources of baits. My understanding is they're now using things like rock crab, green crab, Jonah crabs, other things that they could chop up and put in their pots that they put out in the Sound.
Has that bill been signed yet by the governor?
Yes, the governor has signed it.
And why is this a problem we have to address now?
I think, as Jo Marie mentioned, for scientists for a number of years have been documenting their decline within the Long Island Sound. I think the report that really spurred a lot of attempts to address these issues by lawmakers and by DEEP was the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Council came out in 2019 and said that stocks of these animals, specifically within the New York region, were rated as in poor condition. And you've also seen it in a couple other states. New Jersey has enacted their own moratorium on the commercial harvest of horseshoe crabs. South Carolina issued a moratorium several years ago. So this is really a bipartisan issue in places where these crabs make their home that has attracted support from members of both the Democratic and Republican aisle.
Go off that, Joe Marie. Are there any limitations to the Connecticut ban? Like, do we need a regional effort to address the decline of horseshoe crabs?
We may, because they are a migratory species. I think that having Connecticut make a ban on the harvest in Long Island Sound is a good start. But if New York doesn't follow suit and have more strict regulations or also a ban, I mean, we're looking at the same population of crabs that's being managed by two states, even though they're the same population, and they've been doing it differently for as long as the horseshoe crabs have been here. The other complication here is that we won't see the effects of this ban for a long time. It takes horseshoe crabs 10 to 12 years to become sexually mature and start reproducing. So say we stop the ban of horseshoe crabs, this October, it's going to take us at least 10 years to see how that's impacting the population. So this isn't like a quick fix. It's going to have to be a long-term one.
What other states are also working to protect these species? Are there lessons we might learn from them?
I do know that in New Jersey and in the Delaware Bay area, when they enacted their moratorium, there were positive impacts on the population that did allow them to reopen the harvest for males only. And that seemed to, satisfy both sides, where there's enough harvest happening for the pharmaceutical industry while still allowing the population to maintain and be sustainable.
Earlier in the program, we talked about Dr. Jennifer Mattei, the founder of Project Limulus. Before she died last year, she was instrumental in horseshoe crab preservation for years. Can you tell us a bit more about her legacy?
Jennifer was really passionate about horseshoe crabs and their conservation, but also about education and kind of restoration in general. So not only did she run Project Limulus for all of those years, where she mentored, dozens of undergraduate and graduate research students every summer, giving, 10 to 15 different public outreach events and talks to educate the general public, whether that was young school children or kind of, we've done talks at retirement homes, which are really fun as well. But also she was a fantastic educator at Sacred Heart for over 25 years and was, like you said, instrumental in kind of getting this bill even passed. She wrote some really compelling testimony back when they were initially trying to get the bill done that we were able to resubmit this time around as well. But she was just a champion for education, a champion for the environment, and a champion for the horseshoe crab for sure. She sat on the IUCN Species Specialist Group for horseshoe crabs and was one of their education chairs. So she had the opportunity to go internationally to present research on horseshoe crabs and the impacts of education and kind of using horseshoe crabs as a flagship species for education and conservation. She was just an incredible woman for sure.
How's your work been impacted by her loss? Like, was she somebody you were able to bounce back and forth off of?
Oh, absolutely. So like I said, I started out as one of her undergraduate mentees back in 2008. And she was always somebody who really championed my education and kind of pushed me to go above and beyond and reach where I am today. So we were, colleagues, coworkers, friends. I definitely miss her a lot.
I would just add regarding Dr. Mattei's legacy, I was on the House floor earlier this year when they passed the bill that would ban the harvest, and the lawmaker who's really been behind these efforts for the past couple of years, Representative Joe Gresco of Stratford, he brought up Dr. Mattei and her work, and sadly her death just before the House voted to pass this ban. So her legacy really carried there through the legislature as they were considering this year.
How do you think listeners should participate in the protection of these species? What can they do if they're moved?
So there's a couple of levels of participation. You can join us at the beach one time during the summer for an event to learn more about these amazing creatures, maybe help participate in our community science efforts and actually tag and measure horseshoe crabs. You can just go on our website and look at some of the literature that we have there. We also accept donations for our education program. So that's www.projectlimulus.org, or you could always just Google Sacred Heart and horseshoe crabs and we usually pop up. If you're on the beach and you happen to see a horseshoe crab that's stranded and stuck on its back, you could always flip it over and just help it get back to the water so that it doesn't dry out and become seagull food. So those are kind of some different ways, some more simple, some that are more engaging, I guess, if you want to come and participate in the research.
John Moritz works with CT Insider. Jo Marie Kasanak works with Project Limulus. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thanks to Jo Marie and John for helping us understand what horseshoe crabs mean to Connecticut. Next up, shellfish. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. As part of Connecticut Public's first ever NautiWeek, we're spending this hour looking at sea creatures getting attention at the state capitol. We just heard all about horseshoe crabs, and now we're going to pivot to shellfish. We have a lot of different types of shellfish in Connecticut, but the oyster is by far the best known. In fact, the eastern oyster was named our state shellfish in 1989. Besides being delicious, oysters and other shellfish are pretty important to Connecticut's economy. There are more than 70,000 acres of shellfish farms in Connecticut's coastal waters. Shellfishing provides more than 300 jobs statewide and generates $30 million plus in sales annually. For more on this, we're joined by Tessa Getchis, an aquaculture extension educator with the Connecticut Sea Grant and Yukon Extension Program. Good morning, Tessa.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Pleasure to have you on. I want to start by asking you about the importance of shellfish in Connecticut. Why are these creatures so important here?
They're incredibly important. Shellfishing is a way of life in Connecticut. It provides us with a great, healthy source of food, provides jobs, and also a bunch of ecosystem services. That's just a term for all of the beneficial factors like water quality improvement, water clarity, and the habitat that those shellfish provide for a number of different organisms.
Oysters, very important here to the local industry here in Connecticut, and obviously the enjoyment of Connecticut as well. Oysters, what other kind of shellfish will you find here that are prominent?
We have clams and mussels. Oysters are our state shellfish, though, so they're incredibly important.
And I want you to kind of walk us through the rich history of shellfish along Connecticut's shoreline. They always been a staple of our coast?
They have been, and long before we colonized this area, they were very important to the first settlers of this area. So they were harvested seasonally, and then an industry came about very quickly as the colonists came here.
So why have the shellfish populations decreased in recent years? What are the reasons for that?
Historically, overfishing was a problem, But in most recent years, our extensive oyster habitat has been impacted by mainly silt coming down from rivers after rainstorms. So these extreme rainfall events cause a whole host of problems when we have runoff from land.
Congressman Joe Courtney has been active in pushing for shellfish restoration, including securing funding for those in the shellfish industry during the pandemic. Here's what he told us.
Oysters are man's best friend when it comes to cleaning up Long Island Sound. Just their whole sort of biological process results in actually a cleaner environment.
Oysters are man's best friend. Do you agree with that statement? And tell us about the importance of oysters on our community.
It's a true statement. Oysters are nature's filter feeder. So as they're feeding, they're actually removing all of this other matter from the environment. They're feeding, they're removing nutrients, and they're clarifying the water as they're doing that.
I want you to talk to me about efforts in recent years to restore the oyster population in Connecticut. What types of policies have been put in place or have been proposed?
In the mid-2000s, the state was working with a number of different organizations to develop a shellfish restoration plan. And the pandemic came at a actually opportune time. It was a really devastating time for the industry because they were shut out of the marketplace when restaurants closed. But state regulators worked together with other organizations to find a way to use the industry to restore those shellfish beds.
One of the owners of Copp's Island Oysters said at the time that they had lost 90% of business at that time when the pandemic, it didn't allow folks to sell not only to restaurants in Connecticut because they're shuttered, but you're talking about wholesale business to places like Texas, New York. What was the result of the pandemic? Did people lose business altogether or did things kind of settle?
Well, the shellfish marketplace actually collapsed overnight in Connecticut and throughout the country, frankly. It was devastating. And we really expected that we'd lose businesses. But in Connecticut, we didn't. We were able to bounce back.
What spurred this bounce back? Was it policies at the state level? Was it policies at the federal level? Maybe a little of both?
It was both. So one program was available through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So they provided emergency response funding. And also the U.S. Department of Agriculture changed its rules to expand eligibility for these types of programs for aquaculture as well. And so I mentioned we were working on a shellfish restoration plan during that time. We needed people, we needed boats to develop a restoration program. We didn't have anyone to do that. When those businesses were virtually shut down because the restaurants were closed, we had this able-bodied workforce. And so we were able to capitalize on that and get those farmers involved in shellfish restoration.
I'm going to play another clip for you because I love to hear from Congressman Joe Courtney so much, but he's very passionate about this issue. So let's hear from the congressman.
Frankly, there's always been this sort of institutional bias, particularly in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that really struggles with sort of putting aquaculture on par with land-based agriculture, row crops, what you normally think of as quote unquote farming. And we've seen that sort of play itself out in Farm Bill enactments over the years where, again, attempts to sort of put aquaculture in the same sort of level of support for things like marketing, research within the U.S. Department of Agriculture has run into real resistance, both internally within the department and also members of Congress.
That's really been a long battle for Joe Courtney and other members of Congress. You talked about that NOAA pot of money that came during the pandemic. It was only like a couple $1 million to be split for people in Connecticut, but there was eventually a change, right? You talk about that second component, the USDA, that kind of reflected a shift in how people, the federal government, looked at aquaculture?
Absolutely. Our state has long recognized that aquaculture is agriculture. It's just in the water. USDA has done that, but they've been able to expand their programs and more recently included this disaster response funding for aquaculture in Connecticut.
These shellfish restoration efforts in Connecticut, they involved the development of something called the Connecticut Shellfish Restoration Guide. What's that outline? How does it help kind of facilitate shellfish restoration?
Well, we had to start from a place of where we knew we had oysters and where we knew oyster populations were either impacted by the silt that I mentioned before or impacted in some way that they needed to be restored. So this guide sets the stage for what our oyster resources looked like in the past, what they look like now, and what we can do to improve their condition.
It seems to kind of build upon the 2016 Shellfish Initiative. Do I have that right?
Absolutely.
And what is it?
So the Shellfish Initiative in Connecticut was modeled after the National Shellfish Initiative. That was to get more shellfish in the water through restoration and aquaculture, important for all those ecosystem services that we talked about before. And Connecticut actually passed a bill in 2021 to promote shellfish restoration within the state itself.
If we put those two together, how effective have these kind of restoration efforts been so far? Do we have any kind of data, anything like that?
So we do. What we've done is created a map of the areas that we've surveyed. So we have thousands of acres of shellfish beds across the state. We've focused in on oysters, of course, because they're habitat forming and provide many more ecosystem benefits. We have oyster beds from Greenwich all the way to Stonington, and we've been able to prioritize them according to their condition.
What's been the role of oyster farmers and harvesters in these restoration efforts? Would you say they're all on board?
I think they are. And why they are is because they're dependent on those beds. Many of those beds early on in the late 1800s and early 1900s were protected by Superior Court. And those were set aside for the use of aquaculture. And those beds have, with little intervention over the past 100 or so years, actually sustained the industry. So with harvest and those stringent protection measures, they've been able to keep 51 operations alive.
What's the major opposition to all of this? Was there any kind of major opposition? Does it cut across a partisan divide? Like, who was against some of these 2021 laws or efforts to, I guess, make aquaculture on par with agriculture?
I think we've seen a lot of support for aquaculture and also shellfish restoration. It's really about site selection. So for aquaculture farms, most of our underwater space in Long Island Sound, actually about 20% of it is already farmed. Not actively farmed all at one time, but collectively it's the largest farm in Connecticut. But as we start to see changes in the use of gear or containers to grow shellfish, of course that's visible in the public eye. That could interfere with other activities. But there are very stringent regulations to make sure that there aren't any use conflicts and to minimize any impacts to habitats or protected species.
The impact of the taxation on, I think it was the waterfront properties, that drew some criticism, I think, from the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities in terms of gathering back some tax revenue that some of these towns might have been losing. Has there been any kind of resolution from that? Have they been able to show that they've been able to get back some tax revenue? What's been the response to kind of that opposition?
So the conference brought in a number of educators and also regulators of aquaculture activity to discuss that issue and recognize that there isn't a huge tax base there. And again, that this is farming activity that's critical, and also that these shellfish provide an environmental service. And so much different than what you would tax in coastal property.
What about additional laws and policies that could help shellfish restoration in Connecticut? What else can policymakers do? What would you maybe like to see these policymakers do?
Well, right now, that bill is also to promote shell recycling. So oysters and other shells that are typically discarded when they're shucked at restaurants, they come from the water. They should be put back in the water. They're critical substrate for oyster reefs. If oysters don't have those oyster shells, there's no way they can rebuild and sustain their populations. And so we're trying to figure out ways to work with state agencies to capture that shell from restaurants and other events, where, casinos, wherever that shellfish may be, and make it easy for them to get that shell cured and then back in the water.
You've done that already with oysters, though. Can you tell us a little bit about, or at least you've begun exploring that? Can you tell us a little bit about that effort and what it takes to kind of recycle the shells?
Sure. So we haven't done it ourselves, but we have, the town of Fairfield has a nice program that they have. It's a very small scale program, but it's been quite successful working with several local restaurants. So they provide sealed buckets to the restaurants. Those shells in the buckets are then collected. They're cured on land for 6 months. All of the organic material is dried by the sun, and then we can put those shells back in the water. Farmers also do this as well. So some of the farmers that are harvesting from natural beds, they have to replenish that shell. And so again, that provides the space for the baby oysters to settle on and produce the next generation.
Love the image of the baby oysters and the effort to kind of recycle these shells. Thank you so much for telling us about that. How much buy-in do you think there is so far for this shell recycling program? And who's buying it?
Well, we have two critical state agencies, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And so they're working together to help facilitate programs across the state. They each have different jurisdiction, and so we're trying to help move that along. And then working with, you need people, cheerleaders, to make this happen, volunteers. And so we're working with nonprofit organizations, universities, municipal officials to try to create town and regional programs.
What about our listeners? What kind of role can they play in restoring shellfish in Connecticut? What can we all do to help?
Well, I think we need to bring awareness about the importance of these shells. So if you're eating an oyster or a clam in a restaurant, have a conversation with the person that's bartending or shucking the shellfish, or if you know the owner. Talk to your local shellfish or harbor management commission, your conservation commission. Get involved and try to figure out how we can do this.
You know so much about this topic. You've definitely piqued my interest more into shellfish. I'm an avid eater of shellfish, but I want to ask you, what got you personally interested in shellfish?
Digging clams with my dad.
All right, so paint the scene for us. Where was this? Where did this take place?
So we had a boat growing up in Mystic, Connecticut. We traveled to the shore every weekend. We would go out in those clam beds. And when I was little, I didn't like getting dirty until I found everything else that was crawling around in the mud and was really curious and just watched my dad. And throughout the years, that, oh, gross, muddiness became, oh, cool, what's that? And it just really motivated me to learn more and learn from his friends who, really taught me about the ocean. And I not only cared about the ocean itself and all of those little critters that live there, but really wanted to find a way to conserve it, to keep it, knowing that it was something that eventually my children would be able to enjoy as well.
That was a very nice anecdote that you painted for us. So just to wrap this up, kind of, what do you think the work that you've been able to do off of that, the work that the Connecticut Sea Grant does, what kind of impact do you think you all have made?
I think collectively we're starting to make a great impact. We're all small organizations, but together we've been able to make big things happen. We have some creative, innovative people from the aquaculture industry that have done great things, especially during COVID. Bouncing back, I think we've secured the future for the industry and also for the environment as well. And I think that that's a job that never stops.
Tessa, thank you so much for joining us in studio. It meant a lot to have you here to dig into your knowledge of the shellfish industry. Thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Dive into NautiWeek coverage from all 6 of Connecticut Public's talk shows by visiting ctpublic.org/NautiWeek. That's NAUTI Week. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton. Technical producers are Katie Tolarski and Kat Pastor. Special thanks to our interns, Stacy Addo and Carol Chen, as well as our colleague, Jenny Ahrens. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thanks for listening.